By late 1941, it seemed as though the war in the East had already been decided. German forces had advanced deeper into Soviet territory than many had believed possible, capturing vast Monadic and encircling entire Red Army formations. Cities fell, supply lines collapsed, and millions of Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner. Reports reaching German high command painted a clear picture. The Soviet Union was breaking. For many German generals, this was not just optimism. It was a conclusion supported by what they were seeing on the ground. The Red Army, which had once appeared vast and formidable, now looked disorganized, weakened, and close to collapse. The expectation was simple. One final push, and the war in the East would be over. But beneath this apparent success, something far less visible was already underway. While German forces focused on rapid advances and decisive victories, Soviet leadership began making decisions that would fundamentally change the course of the war. Entire industries were dismantled and moved eastward, beyond the reach of German bombers. Factories that had once produced civilian goods were converted into centers of military production. Rail networks were reorganized, and resources were redirected towards sustaining a long-term war effort. These changes did not produce immediate results on the battlefield, but they laid the foundation for something far more dangerous, a system capable of rebuilding the Red Army even after catastrophic losses. For German commanders, this transformation was largely invisible. Intelligence reports were often incomplete, delayed, or misinterpreted. The scale of Soviet industrial relocation was difficult to grasp, and the speed at which new forces were being formed went beyond what German planners had anticipated. The belief that the Soviet Union was nearing collapse shaped decisions at every level of command. Offensive operations continued under the assumption that the enemy could not recover in time. This confidence, while understandable given the early successes, created a dangerous gap between perception and reality. At the same time, the nature of the Eastern Front itself began to reveal its complexity. The vast distances, harsh weather conditions, and logistical challenges slowed the German advance. Supply lines stretched further with each kilometer gained, making it increasingly difficult to maintain the pace of operations. What had started as a fast-moving campaign began to lose momentum as autumn turned into winter. Equipment struggled in freezing temperatures, vehicles broke down, and soldiers faced conditions they were not fully prepared for. These factors did not immediately reverse German gains, but they began to limit the ability to achieve the decisive victory that had been expected. Meanwhile, the Red Army, despite its losses, continued to exist in ways that German command had underestimated. New units were being formed, reserves were being mobilized, and defensive positions were being reinforced. The Soviet system, though heavily damaged, was not collapsing, it was adapting. This adaptation was not always visible in individual battles, but over time its effects became more pronounced. The Red Army was not simply surviving, it was reorganizing itself for a prolonged conflict. What makes this moment critical is the contrast between what German generals believed and what was actually happening. On one side, there was a sense of nearing victory, supported by rapid territorial gains and visible enemy losses. On the other, there was a hidden process of recovery and preparation that would soon begin to change the balance of the war. The success of Operation Barbarossa had created an illusion, one that suggested the Soviet Union could not sustain the fight. But that illusion would not last. because while German forces were advancing west to east, the Red Army was rebuilding far beyond their reach and preparing for a war that Germany had not planned to fight. As winter closed in on the Eastern Front, German commanders expected the final phase of the campaign to begin. The Red Army had suffered losses on a scale rarely seen in modern warfare. Entire divisions had been encircled and destroyed, major cities had fallen, and millions of prisoners had been taken. From a German perspective, no army could absorb such damage and continue to function effectively. The assumption was that what remained of Soviet resistance was fragmented, disorganized, and incapable of launching any meaningful counteraction. Plans were shaped around this belief. The focus remained on completing the offensive, securing Kiel-Mudin, and forcing a final collapse before the war dragged into another year. But what German generals could not fully see was how the Soviet system was responding behind the front lines. The losses were real, but they did not lead to paralysis. Instead, they triggered a massive and coordinated effort to rebuild. New units were being formed at a speed that German intelligence struggled to track. Training was often minimal, equipment was sometimes limited, but the scale of mobilization compensated for these weaknesses. The Soviet Union had access to vast reserves of manpower, and it was using them. Soldiers were being moved from distant regions, assembled into new formations, and sent toward the front in continuous waves. The Red Army that Germany had fought in the summer was not the same force that was beginning to take shape in the winter. At the same time, the relocation of industry was starting to produce results. Factories that had been moved east were coming back online, producing tanks, artillery, and ammunition in increasing numbers. The decision to move these Essinerat had been risky and complex, but it ensured that production could continue beyond the reach of German air power. This meant that while German forces were advancing, the Soviet Union was rebuilding its capacity to sustain the war. The impact of this was not immediate, but it created a steady flow of equipment that would support future operations. For German planners, who expected Soviet production to collapse along with its army, this was a critical miscalculation. The first signs that something was wrong began to appear gradually. Reports from the front indicated that resistance was not weakening as expected. Instead of collapsing, Soviet forces were holding positions longer, launching localized counterattacks, and showing a level of coordination that contradicted earlier assessments. In some sectors, German units encountered fresh troops where they had expected to find only remnants. These encounters raised questions, but they did not immediately change the overall belief that victory was within reach. The scale of earlier successes was too large to ignore, and the idea that the Soviet Union could recover so quickly seemed unlikely. Then came the winter conditions, and with them a shift in momentum. Temperatures dropped to extreme levels, affecting both sides, but German forces were less prepared for the conditions they faced. Equipment malfunctioned, fuel supplies became difficult to manage, and soldiers struggled to operate in the freezing environment. The offensive slowed, and in some areas it stopped entirely. This pause created space that the Red Army used to regroup, reinforce, and prepare for action. What had been a continuous German advance was now interrupted, and that interruption allowed the hidden rebuilding effort to move closer to the front. For the first time, German commanders began to face a possibility they had not fully considered. The Red Army was not collapsing. It was still capable of fighting, and more importantly, it was becoming stronger again. The evidence was not yet overwhelming, but it was enough to create doubt. The war in the East was no longer following the expected path. Instead of a rapid conclusion, it was beginning to resemble something far more dangerous, a prolonged conflict against an enemy that refused to disappear. And as the winter deepened, that realization would become impossible to ignore. By early 1942, the Eastern Front had stabilized in a way few German commanders had expected. The rapid advances of the previous summer had slowed, and in some sectors they had stopped entirely. What replaced them was a front that stretched across vast distances where both sides were digging in, regrouping, and preparing for what would come next. For German generals, this pause was often interpreted as temporary, a moment to reorganize before launching new offensives that would finally break Soviet resistance. The belief that the Red Army was on the brink of collapse still lingered, supported by the scale of earlier victories. But along the Linea Fronta, small and often overlooked signs were beginning to suggest something different. German reconnaissance units and frontline commanders started reporting unusual patterns. Soviet forces were not only holding positions, they were reinforcing them. In areas where German units expected weak resistance, they instead encountered fresh defensive lines, supported by artillery and newly arrived troops. These were not the remnants of a broken army. They were structured defenses, built with coordination and intent. In some cases, Soviet units launched limited counterattacks, testing German positions and probing for weaknesses. These actions were not large enough to shift the overall balance of the front, but they indicated a level of organization that contradicted earlier assumptions. The Red Army was not simply reacting, it was preparing. At the same time, intelligence reports began to reveal inconsistencies. Estimates of Soviet troop numbers fluctuated, often increasing rather than decreasing. Equipment that had been assumed destroyed was appearing again in new formations. Tanks, artillery, and support units were being deployed in ways that suggested ongoing production rather than depletion. For German command, this created a growing sense of uncertainty. The initial expectation had been that Soviet capacity to wage war would diminish over time. Instead, it appeared to be stabilizing, and in some areas, even expanding. These developments were difficult to explain within the framework the German planners had been using. Despite these warning signs, the overall interpretation of the situation did not change immediately. Many commanders believed that these were isolated developments, temporary adjustments by an enemy that was still fundamentally weakened. The scale of the earlier campaign had created a strong narrative of inevitable German victory, and that narrative influenced how new information was understood. Reports that suggested Soviet recovery were often viewed with skepticism or attributed to localized conditions rather than a broader trend. This gap between observation and interpretation allowed critical signals to be overlooked at a moment when they mattered most. Meanwhile, deeper behind Soviet lines, the rebuilding process continued at a pace that remained largely hidden. Training centers were producing new units, command structures were being reorganized, and lessons from earlier defeats were being applied to improve coordination and effectiveness. The Red Army was evolving, adapting to the realities of the war in ways that German command had not fully anticipated. This transformation was not dramatic or immediate. It was gradual, built through continuous effort rather than sudden change. But over time, it created a force that was fundamentally different from the one Germany had encountered in 1941. What makes this phase of the war particularly significant is how close German commanders came to understanding the shift, and how often they chose to dismiss it. The evidence was there, visible in reports from the front and patterns in Soviet behavior, but recognizing it required questioning assumptions that had guided the campaign from the beginning. As long as those assumptions remained in place, the true scale of Soviet recovery remained difficult to grasp. And as the months passed, the signs that had once seemed small would begin to form a pattern that could no longer be ignored. By mid-1942, German command was no longer operating in complete certainty, but it was still far from understanding the full reality of what was happening. The early victories of Operation Barbarossa had created a framework of belief that was difficult to abandon. According to that framework, the Soviet Union had already suffered irreparable damage. Its armies had been shattered, its Ilkiada disrupted, and its capacity to sustain prolonged war severely weakened. This assumption continued to influence planning at every level, shaping decisions about future offensives and resource allocation. Even as new information began to emerge, it was often interpreted through the lens of earlier success. The possibility that the Red Army was not only surviving, but rebuilding on a massive scale remained underestimated. German intelligence played a critical role in this miscalculation. Gathering accurate information on the Eastern Front was extremely difficult. The vastness of the Soviet Union, combined with limited reconnaissance capabilities and unreliable communication, created gaps that were hard to fill. Estimates of Soviet troop strength varied widely, and reports were often based on incomplete or outdated data. More importantly, the scale of Soviet mobilization was unlike anything German planners had anticipated. New divisions were being formed faster than they could be tracked, and industrial output, relocated far to the east, was largely beyond German reach. As a result, intelligence assessments consistently underestimated the number of available Soviet forces and the speed at which they were being replenished. At the same time, internal dynamics within German command contributed to the problem. Reports that challenged existing assumptions were not always given the attention they required. In some cases, frontline observations indicating stronger than expected resistance were downplayed or attributed to temporary conditions. In others, intelligence that suggested Soviet recovery was viewed as exaggerated. This was not simply a matter of poor information. It was also a matter of interpretation. The belief in Soviet collapse had become deeply embedded, making it difficult to accept evidence that pointed in a different direction. As a result, decisions continued to be made based on an outdated understanding of the situation. Meanwhile, the Red Army was continuing its transformation. New formations were being integrated into the front, command structures were improving, and coordination between units was becoming more effective. The lessons learned from earlier defeats were being applied, resulting in better defensive positions and more organized counterattacks. Soviet leadership, including figures such as Georgy Zhukov, played a key role in this process, focusing on rebuilding strength and preparing for future offensives. These changes were not always visible in a single battle, but they became increasingly apparent over time. The Red Army was not just replacing losses, it was becoming more capable. The consequences of this intelligence failure became clear as German operations continued. Plans for renewed offensives assumed that Soviet resistance would weaken further, allowing for decisive breakthroughs. Instead, German forces encountered an enemy that was holding, reinforcing, and in some cases counterattacking with increasing effectiveness. The gap between expectation and reality widened, creating operational challenges that were difficult to resolve. What had been intended as a continuation of earlier success was now becoming a more complex and uncertain campaign. What makes this moment particularly important is that the information needed to reassess the situation was already available, but it was not fully recognized or acted upon. The Red Army's rebuilding effort was no longer hidden in the same way it had been in 1941. Signs of recovery were visible and patterns were emerging, but the failure to interpret these signs correctly allowed the situation to develop further without a corresponding change in strategy. And as the war moved into its next phase, the consequences of that misjudgment would become impossible to ignore. By late 1942, the illusion that had shaped German expectations since the beginning of the invasion was beginning to collapse. What had once been seen as a weakened and disorganized enemy was now presenting a very different reality on the battlefield. German forces advancing deeper into Soviet territory, particularly in the south, encountered resistance that was not only persistent, but increasingly structured. The campaign that had been intended to deliver a decisive victory was now stretching into a prolonged and complex conflict. The Red Army, which had been expected to disappear under the weight of earlier defeats, was still there, and more importantly, it was changing. Nowhere was this shift more evident than in the fighting around Stalingrad. German command had launched a major offensive aimed at securing strategic objectives along the Volga and in the Caucasus. The expectation remained that Soviet forces would eventually collapse under sustained pressure, allowing German units to achieve their goals. But as the battle unfolded, the nature of the resistance became clear. Soviet forces held positions within the city, fighting in conditions that reduced the effectiveness of German advantages in mobility and coordination. Reinforcements continued to arrive, even as losses mounted. The scale of commitment suggested that the Red Army was not only capable of sustaining the fight, it was willing to invest heavily in holding critical ground. At the same time, beyond the immediate battlefield, the broader rebuilding effort was reaching a level that could no longer be ignored. Soviet industrial production had increased significantly, supplying tanks, artillery, and ammunition in quantities that supported ongoing operations. New units were being deployed, not as isolated reinforcements, but as part of a larger system that was beginning to function more effectively. German intelligence, which had struggled to track these developments, now faced the reality of their impact. The Red Army was no longer simply reacting, it was shaping the battlefield in ways that challenged German assumptions. For German generals, this created a moment of recognition that had been building for months. The enemy they were facing was not the same one they had encountered in 1941. It had absorbed enormous losses, reorganized its structure, and rebuilt its strength in ways that had not been anticipated. The belief that Soviet capacity was limited had been proven wrong. Instead of weakening over time, the Red Army had stabilized and was now capable of sustained operations across multiple fronts. This realization did not come all at once, but through a series of engagements where expectations failed to match outcomes. The situation at Stalingrad intensified this realization. As German forces became increasingly committed to the battle, their position grew more difficult to maintain. Supply lines were stretched, the environment was demanding, and the Soviet response became more coordinated. What had been intended as a decisive offensive began to turn into a prolonged struggle, where progress was measured in small gains rather than rapid advances. The longer the battle continued, the more it exposed the limitations of German strategy under these conditions. What made this moment particularly significant was not just the difficulty of the fighting, but what it revealed about the broader war. The Red Army had not only survived, it had rebuilt itself into a force capable of challenging German operations at a strategic level. This was no longer a campaign defined by German initiative alone. The balance was beginning to shift, and with it, the nature of the conflict. For the first time, German generals were forced to confront a reality they had not planned for. The war in the East was not approaching its end. It was entering a new phase, one in which the enemy they thought was finished was becoming stronger with every passing month. By early 1943, the reality that German commanders had been slow to accept was now impossible to ignore. The Red Army was no longer rebuilding in the background. It was actively shaping the course of the war. The turning point came as Soviet forces launched large-scale offensives that went far beyond localized counterattacks. These were coordinated operations planned across multiple fronts, supported by increasing numbers of troops, tanks, and artillery. What German generals had once dismissed as temporary resistance had evolved into a sustained and organized push that threatened entire sections of the front. The initiative, which had belonged to Germany since the beginning of the invasion, was beginning to shift. The encirclement and eventual defeat of German forces at Stalingrad marked a decisive moment in this transformation. What had been intended as a strategic victory became one of the most significant losses suffered by the German army. Soviet operations surrounding the city demonstrated a level of coordination and planning that contradicted earlier assumptions about their capabilities. Entire German formations were cut off, isolated, and ultimately forced to surrender. For German command, this was not just a battlefield setback. It was a clear indication that the Red Army had regained the ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations. The idea that the Soviet Union was nearing collapse could no longer be maintained. At the same time, Soviet offensives extended beyond Stalingrad, targeting multiple sectors of the Eastern Front. German forces, already stretched thin, found themselves reacting to attacks rather than initiating them. Defensive positions were established, but they were often under constant pressure, with limited time to reorganize or reinforce. The Red Army was no longer fighting for survival. It was advancing, pushing back German positions and reclaiming territory. The scale of these operations revealed the full impact of the rebuilding process that had taken place over the previous 2 years. Leadership played a crucial role in this shift. Soviet commanders, including figures such as Georgy Zhukov, had adapted their approach based on earlier experiences, improving coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery. This allowed for more effective planning and execution of complex operations. On the German side, commanders were forced to adjust to a situation where the assumptions that had guided earlier campaigns no longer applied. The expectation of weakening Soviet resistance had been replaced by the need to manage a front where the enemy was growing stronger. The consequences of this shift extended beyond individual battles. German strategy, which had relied on rapid offensives and decisive engagements, was now constrained by the need to hold defensive positions across a vast front. Resources were stretched, and the ability to concentrate forces for new offensives became increasingly limited. At the same time, the Red Army's ability to sustain pressure created a dynamic where German units were constantly reacting, often without the opportunity to regain initiative. What made this moment decisive was not just the scale of Soviet success, but what it represented. The rebuilding effort that had once been hidden was now fully visible, expressed through operations that changed the direction of the war. The Red Army was no longer a force recovering from defeat. It was a force capable of determining the outcome of the conflict. For German generals, the realization was complete. The war they had expected to end quickly had become a prolonged struggle against an enemy that had not only survived, but transformed itself into a stronger and more effective force. And from this point forward, the Eastern Front would no longer be defined by German advance, but by the steady and relentless pressure of a Red Army that had come back stronger than anyone had anticipated. By mid-1943, the Eastern Front had reached a point where the balance of power had shifted in a way that could no longer be reversed through a single offensive. German command, aware of the growing strength of the Red Army, attempted to regain the initiative through one final large-scale operation, the offensive at Kursk. The plan was designed to encircle Soviet forces and restore momentum after the losses of the previous months. It was a calculated attempt to reassert control over the front, using concentrated armored equipment and coordinated attacks to achieve a decisive result. But unlike earlier campaigns, this operation faced an enemy that was prepared, reinforced, and fully aware of what was coming. Soviet intelligence had identified the German plans in advance, allowing the Red Army to construct layered defensive positions across the Kursk salient. Minefields, anti-tank defenses, and fortified Herat were established in depth, creating a battlefield that was fundamentally different from the open engagements of 1941. When German forces launched their attack in July 1943, they encountered resistance that slowed their advance from the very beginning. Progress was measured in limited gains, often at significant cost. The conditions that had once allowed German forces to achieve rapid breakthroughs no longer existed. Instead, every movement forward required sustained effort, and each advance was met with organized counteraction. At the same time, the Red Army demonstrated a level of operational coordination that reflected the full impact of its rebuilding process. Once the German offensive lost momentum, Soviet forces transitioned into their own counteroffensives, pushing back against weakened positions and reclaiming territory. The scale of these operations made it clear that the Red Army was no longer reacting. It was dictating the pace of the war. German units, which had once driven deep into Soviet territory, were now being forced into defensive positions across multiple sectors. The initiative had shifted completely, and with it, the nature of the conflict. For German generals, this marked the point where the war in the East could no longer be controlled in the way they had originally planned. The assumptions that had guided earlier strategy, rapid victory, weakening resistance, and the inability of the Soviet Union to recover, had all been proven wrong. Instead, they faced an opponent that had rebuilt its strength, adapted its methods, and gained the ability to sustain large-scale operations over time. The options available to German command became increasingly limited. Offensive operations carried greater risk, while defensive strategies required resources that were becoming harder to maintain. At the same time, pressure from other fronts began to increase. Allied forces were gaining momentum in other regions, forcing Germany to divide its attention and resources. The Eastern Front, already demanding in scale and intensity, became even more difficult to manage as additional challenges emerged. the ability to concentrate forces in one area was reduced, and the overall strategic situation became more complex. What had once been a campaign defined by focus and surat was now shaped by the need to respond to multiple threats simultaneously. The outcome of this phase of the war was not determined by a single battle but by a series of developments that reinforced one another. The failure at Kursk, the continued advance of the Red Army, and the growing pressure from other fronts all contributed to a situation where German control over the war began to slip away. The rebuilding of the Red Army, once hidden and underestimated, had now fully revealed its impact. From this point forward, the direction of the Eastern Front was clear. German forces would continue to fight, but they would do so without the strategic initiative that had defined their earlier campaigns. The war had entered a new stage, one where the balance had shifted, and where the consequences of earlier miscalculations would continue to shape the outcome. By late 1943 and into 1944, the full consequences of what German generals had failed to understand were unfolding across the Eastern Front. The Red Army was no longer rebuilding, it had rebuilt. What had once been hidden behind the vast distances of the Soviet Union was now visible in every major engagement, every offensive, and every kilometer of ground that was being retaken. German forces, which had once advanced deep into Soviet territory with speed and confidence, were now in continuous retreat. The scale of Soviet operations had grown to a level that made them impossible to contain through localized defenses or temporary stabilization. The war in the East had been transformed, not by a single moment, but by a process that had gone largely unnoticed until it was too late to reverse. This transformation reached its peak during massive Soviet offensives such as Operation Barbarossa in 1944. Entire German formations were overwhelmed, positions collapsed, and the front line shifted rapidly westward. These were not isolated successes. They were coordinated campaigns executed across multiple sectors, supported by overwhelming numbers of troops, armor, and artillery. The Red Army had achieved the ability to plan and execute operations on a scale that matched, and in many cases exceeded, anything Germany could respond to. What had once been considered impossible, the full recovery and expansion of Soviet military power, had become the defining reality of the war. For German command, there was no longer any uncertainty. The realization that had begun as doubt in 1942 had become certainty. The Red Army had not only survived the initial invasion, it had used that time to rebuild itself into a force capable of defeating Germany. The intelligence failures, the underestimation of Soviet capacity, and the assumptions made early in the campaign had all contributed to a situation that could no longer be corrected. Decisions that had been based on incomplete understanding now had lasting consequences. The opportunity to achieve a decisive victory had passed, and with it, the ability to shape the outcome of the war on Germany's terms. At the same time, the broader strategic situation made recovery even more difficult. Allied forces were advancing from the west, increasing pressure on German resources and forcing a division of attention that further weakened the Eastern Front. What had once been a concentrated campaign had become a multi-front conflict, where Germany was reacting rather than leading. The Red Army's advance continued, pushing toward Central Europe and eventually into Germany itself. The distance that German forces had once covered in their advance was now being reversed step by step under very different conditions. What makes this story significant is not only how the Red Army rebuilt, but how that rebuilding was understood, or rather misunderstood, by those facing it. The process had been gradual, complex, and largely hidden during its early stages. By the time it became fully visible, it had already reached a point where it could not be stopped through conventional means. The war had not been lost in a single battle, but through a series of misjudgments that allowed an underestimated enemy to recover and grow stronger over time. Looking back, the moment German generals discovered that the Red Army was rebuilding in secret was not a single event, but a realization that unfolded over months of fighting. It was the point where expectation and reality no longer aligned, where the assumptions of early victory gave way to the reality of a prolonged and unwinnable conflict. The Red Army's recovery did not just change the balance of power, it changed the direction of the war itself. And in the end, it showed that in a conflict of this scale, what remains unseen can be just as decisive as what happens on the battlefield.